Coming up in today's newscast, Israel responds to Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah's weekend threats. Far-right Polish nationalists protests on Holocaust Remembrance Day at the Auschwitz extermination camp. And the Jewish state finally gives approval for the export of medical cannabis. Israeli officials have now responded to Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah's claims from over the weekend, in which Nasrallah finally broke his silence on Operation Northern Shield and other Israeli military interventions in the region. In his 3-hour interview on Saturday, the terror group's head acknowledged that Hezbollah does indeed have terror tunnels, but he continued to chastise the IDF for having taken so long to find them. He also allegedly said that there are more tunnels yet undiscovered by Israeli forces, before warning Israel not to continue its so-called policy of aggression north of the border in Lebanon and in Syria. But despite the threatening rhetoric, leaders in the Israeli government like Prime Minister Netanyahu and former IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot are not buying in or easing up. In fact, Eisenkot responded to Nasrallah saying that his claim that, quote, there are things that we don't know about is baseless, adding that we assessed that there was a tunnel project like this, and beginning in 2014, we had specific knowledge of the program. When we decided to act, we acted, and within 6 weeks we destroyed all the attack tunnels into northern Israel. We have clear knowledge that this project was foiled, end quote. And then speaking at the weekly cabinet meeting on Sunday, Netanyahu also explained that he believes Nasrallah is lashing out with a bluff.
לנסראללה יש סיבות טובות לא לרצות להרגיש את נחת זרוענו.
Yesterday, Sunday, January 27th, the world marked International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and while Israel's commemoration was a bit more subdued than in previous years, there were still some very powerful moments. First, on Sunday morning, the Prime Minister met with 3 Holocaust survivors, Moshe HaElyon, Malka Steinmetz, and Motka Wiesel, where he listened to their stories of survival and eventual immigration to Israel. And all 3 had survived incalculable horrors at the hands of the Nazi regime. Their families, unfortunately, were not so lucky to have survived at all. Then afterwards, Netanyahu invited the trio to the weekly Sunday cabinet meeting for his briefing on International Holocaust Memorial Day, where he championed how far Israel and the Jewish people have come.
בשואה היה העם היהודי חסר ישע לחלוטין. היום מדינת היהודים היא בין המתקדמות והחזקות בעולם. בראש ובראשונה השבנו לעמנו את כוח ההתנגדות שעבד לנו בגלות. בניגוד לאוזלת היד הנוראה של עמנו אז, היום אנו מכים במבקשי נפשנו ופוגעים בכל מי שמנסה לפגוע בנו. באותה עת איננו שוכחים לרגע את מתינו, את צוררנו ואת מצילנו. באותה מידה אנחנו מכבדים את זכרם של חסידי אומות העולם. היום מוסר עלות בירושלים משלט לזכרו של הקונסול היפני סוג'יהרה, שהציל אלפי יהודים באירופה בזמן השואה. אנו מרכינים ראש לזכרו.
Additionally, the Israeli premier took a moment to condemn the ongoing anti-Semitism in Europe and elsewhere, while calling on the international community to band together and act.
אנטישמיות מהימין איננה תופעה חדשה שם. מה שחדש באירופה זה השילוב של האנטישמיות האסלאמיסטית והאנטישמיות של השמאל הקיצוני, שמתעטפת בגלימה של אנטי-ציונות, כמו שקורה לאחרונה בבריטניה ובאירלנד. בושה. אנו מוקיעים את כל צורות האנטישמיות באשר הן.
Then later in the day, Netanyahu made similar calls to action while meeting with an economic and defense-related delegation from New Zealand. New Zealand's Defense Minister, Ron Mark, responded by reiterating his nation's commitment, quote, going back as far as 1954. Now, amidst the many commemoration ceremonies around the world for International Holocaust Remembrance Day on Sunday, one in particular is now standing out, and not for good reason. While Holocaust survivors and Polish government officials came together at the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland to mark the 74th anniversary of the liberation of the camp, dozens of Polish nationalist demonstrators from the Polish independence movement gathered at the opposite end of the camp in protest. This was the first time that a far-right protest rally has been held at Auschwitz on the same day as Holocaust Victims' Remembrance Day. And the demonstrators, led by fringe activist Piotr Rybak, were there accusing the Polish government of focusing only on the Jewish victims of the Holocaust and ignoring the Poles, Soviets, Roma, and others who were murdered by the Nazis. The protesters' assertions are far from correct, however, as the official government ceremony made many references to all the victims of the Nazi regime, regardless of their different backgrounds. Additionally, representatives from Russia and many other nations were also present for the official commemoration. It was asserted correctly, though, that most of the victims in the Holocaust, and indeed those most targeted, were in fact Jewish. And herein lies the protesters' true issue, as exposed by Rybak's own words. He told reporters at the rally that he and his mob were there to combat the narrative that millions of Jews were murdered by the Nazis, which is a fact, as well as against the idea that Poland collaborated with the Nazis, which is also verifiable through mountains of evidence and Nazi records left over from the war. In fact, over 3 million of Poland's 3.2 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis, accounting for nearly 50% of the total Jewish victims. Rybak also then reportedly stated that, quote, "It's time to fight against Jewry and free Poland from them," end quote.
Nacja żydowska I Izrael robi wszystko, żeby zmienić historię państwa polskiego. Nacja żydowska robi wszystko, żeby zmienić historię tego obozu. Nie ma zgody patriotów polskich, nie ma zgody nacjonalistów polskich, żeby ktokolwiek zmieniał historię Polski I tego obozu.
Further, in addition to these aforementioned statements, Rybak has a long history of making anti-Semitic remarks and actions. For example, in 2017, he was sentenced to prison for 3 months for burning an effigy of an ultra-Orthodox Jewish man during a protest against admitting Muslim Syrian refugees into Europe. Speaking of Europe, Israel is set to host the leaders of Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic in February for a conference intent on improving upon the already growing relations between the Jewish state and these so-called Visegrad nations. And in the wake of International Holocaust Memorial Day and the growing rates of anti-Semitism in Europe, Prime Minister Netanyahu is also expected to call on these 4 nations to help counter alleged anti-Israel biases in the international community. Joining me now with more is founder and executive director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, Dr. Martin Sherman. Dr. Sherman, as always, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me back.
All right, so first of all, what do you expect to come out of asking the Visegrad countries to, help us more in the international community? Because haven't we already been doing that?
Well, I think, it's sort of a bit of choreography for Netanyahu. It's just another one in the long list of diplomatic successes he's had in the last few months, Africa, with Chad, Brazil.
So you mean ahead of elections, you mean?
And I think he's been careful to showcase them prior to the election, and, he does deserve credit for it. I understand there are going to be more high-profile visits in the future from Austria, Liberia. I think what's more important in the context of the meeting itself is the choreography rather than the substance. I think that it'll probably end with a declaration of cooperation, goodwill, etc., etc.
Okay, well, being that you just said, given the fact that you just said, it's probably more choreography and appearances than anything substantive. Let's still talk a little bit about the substance of this meeting, because does it make sense to necessarily ask these specific countries to, be coming to our aid and be our defense in the EU when historically, they all come from a pretty opposite background. Yeah. And Poland, for example, still has the Polish Holocaust law, which bans,
Well, there's a certain amount of irony to it, and you see Israel gravitating towards countries which have been perhaps more traditionally anti-Semitic and distancing itself, or being distanced from countries which traditionally have been more liberal, like France and countries like that. So there's a certain amount of irony to it, but
why do you think that
perhaps there's something beyond the anti-Semitism here, which is to try and drive a wedge within the EU against the almost wall-to-wall anti-Israel sentiment that there is in the more traditional EU countries, the older EU countries, on the issue of Palestine and Iran, because these Central European countries are more nationalistic, and in sort of the clash between nationalism and globalization. They tend, like Israel, to have a stronger nationalistic sentiment and a stronger anti-Muslim element in them, or at least opposing the large-scale Muslim immigration into Europe. So this driving a wedge into the EU unanimity may be one of the reasons behind the anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism slogan.
All right. Well, we're gonna see next month, pretty soon. Then whether or not it really is substantive or not. And thank you so much for coming in, Dr. Sherman.
Thank you for having me.
Tensions in Venezuela are on the rise today as more countries follow the United States in recognizing the president of the National Assembly and opposition leader in Venezuela, Juan Guaido. this as the legitimate president of the South American country. And yesterday, after Israel finally joined in backing the United States' decision, Guaido expressed his gratitude towards Israel, claiming that his country is fighting for freedom. First, after being pressured by the United States, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a short video where he announced Israel's recognition of Guaido in a short statement.
Israel joins the United States, Canada, most of the countries of Latin America, and countries in Europe in recognizing the new leadership in Venezuela.
And this announcement came right on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, something that Guaido remarked upon when he thanked Israel for its support. The opposition leader took to Twitter to express his gratitude by saying, quote, 74 years ago, the Auschwitz concentration camp was liberated, and today, just as our country is also fighting for its freedom, we thank the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, for the recognition and support, end quote. And Guaido wasn't the only one to welcome Israel's decision either. Both the United States Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, and United States Middle East Peace Envoy Jason Greenblatt hailed Netanyahu's statement. On his Twitter, Greenblatt wrote that Israel takes a courageous stand in solidarity with the Venezuelan people. According to reports, however, Jerusalem originally refused to recognize Guaido because Israel feared for the remaining Venezuelan Jewish community, especially as the government of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who took office for the second time, has been characterized by strong anti-Semitic rhetoric and has expressed its support for Iran, Syria, and even terror organizations like Hamas on many occasions. In fact, the Venezuelan Jewish community used to be one of the largest in South America at around 25,000 when Chavez became president, where today only around 6,000 Jews still remain. The ongoing crisis plus the anti-Semitism in the country made it impossible for people to stay, and they fled mostly to Israel and the United States. But back to the current situation, the Australian government has also now announced its recognition of Guaido as the president, joining the United States, Canada, France, Spain, and many Latin American countries. However, as expected, the Palestinian Authority issued a statement last week voicing their continued support for Maduro and condemning other countries' intervention. And even though Maduro backed down on his original demand that United States diplomats leave Venezuela within 30 days, the leader continues to blame the United States and Europe for their intervention. Nicolas Maduro also rejected the ultimatum from the international community to call for elections within 8 days, and he assured that he is preparing for the most important military exercises in 200 years of history.
Esto es un movimiento cívico, no pretende tener ningún tipo de connotación política, sino movimiento cívico en busca de que cese la usurpación, de que respeten el gobierno de transición para que finalmente podamos tener unas elecciones libres, transparentes para todos los venezolanos.
In other South American news, the death toll in Brazil has just risen to at least 58 after a dam at an iron ore mine in Minas Gerais burst on Friday. And in one of the first collaborations between Israel and Brazil, an Israeli search and rescue team has just landed in Minas Gerais on Sunday night to assist local crews in the emergency efforts. More than 130 IDF soldiers and a Zaca delegation traveled to Brazil to assist in the search for hundreds of people that are still thought missing. The burst of the dam on Friday released a torrent of water and mud, leaving a 500-foot-wide path of destruction. And so on Saturday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke with Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and offered to send immediate Israeli assistance to the site.
We've come here 132 soldiers and officers, the best that Israel can offer to Brazil in its hard time. We have here engineers, technological experts, search and rescue responders, all kinds of devices who help us to locate missing people.
According to the Brazilian Fire Department, there are around 300 people still missing, and the chances of finding people alive are rapidly dropping. Further, the search for potential survivors was suspended yesterday, and thousands of local residents were evacuated over fears that another dam in the area, also owned by the company VLSA, could collapse. But now the operation has resumed, entering the 4th day of searches, and the Israeli team is working in the area to help find the missing people, most of whom are unfortunately already presumed dead. The Brazilian government has promised to investigate the incident, however, and the governor of Minas Gerais also assured that those responsible for the dam break would be exemplarily punished. In a horrifying story, the bodies of 2 Israeli sisters have just been found in Argentina, and the sisters' son/nephew has now been charged with their murders. 63-year-old Firia Sarusi and 54-year-old Dr. Lily Pereg went missing on January 12th in Mendoza, Argentina, and the women had last communicated with their families in Israel and Australia at 2:30 in the morning the day before, Friday, January 11th. Well now, last week Friday, Dr. Lily Pereg's son, Gil, was arrested after bloodstains were found on a shirt and on a bag of cement in his home. Argentinian authorities also reportedly discovered 4 guns, as well as around $80,000 in euros, dollars, and pesos. So with this evidence in mind, Gil Pereg has now been charged with aggravated and simple homicide in the death of his family members. Also, he has already been sent for psychological evaluation because of concerns that he may try to harm himself. Argentinian media claims that he was in a precarious financial situation before the killings, and DNA evidence found at the scene proves that both his mother and aunt had entered his home on January 12th, the day that they were both killed. Now here's something new. The International Paralympic Committee, or IPC, has just decided to strip Malaysia of its rights to host the 2019 Para-Swimming Championships, and all because the Southeast Asian country is refusing to let Israeli athletes participate. The championships were set to take place in Kuching on the island of Borneo between July 29th and August 4th, and around 600 swimmers from a whopping 60 nations were expected to take part in the Kuching event, with over 160 world titles up for grabs. But earlier this month, the Malaysian government decided to ban Israelis from entering the country for the event. Foreign Minister Saifuddin Abdullah even said, quote, "Malaysia will not host any event that has representation or participation of Israel," end quote. Israel, of course, responded by pushing the IPC to either force a change in that decision then, or move the venue. And it seems that the committee has now decided to take the latter option by refraining from holding the competition in Malaysia at all. The IPC explained that politics and sports do not mix, and that all athletes should be able to compete without facing discrimination, adding that the committee would have made the same decision regardless of which countries were involved in the conflict. This diplomatic spat isn't shocking to Israel, however, as the Prime Minister of Malaysia has a long history of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel comments. In a 2012 blog, for example, he wrote that, quote, "Jews rule the world by proxy," end quote. And in an interview with the BBC, he claimed that the problems in the Middle East only began with the creation of Israel. It's also no surprise, then, that Malaysia and Israel have very tumultuous relations. In fact, no Israeli passport holders are permitted to enter Malaysia without written permission from the Ministry of Home Affairs, which isn't often given. Moving on, listen up Eurovision fans, because it has finally been announced. We now know who will be hosting this year's Eurovision contest in Israel, and the lineup is looking good. Television hosts Erez Tal, Asi Azar, and Lucy Ayub will all reportedly be taking the stage alongside world-famous supermodel Bar Refaeli. This in spite of the fact that the Israeli model is currently facing a series of legal issues. Since the beginning of this year, it was reported that organizers were concerned that Refaeli wouldn't be able to host because of her busy legal case, and state prosecutors are planning to press charges against the supermodel along with her parents on suspicion of money laundering and tax-dodging offenses. Authorities believe that Refaeli lied by saying she lived primarily abroad, while she also failed to report to Israeli tax officials pricey gifts and celebrity discounts that she received. Now, Refaeli's defense team has denied any wrongdoing, but the case is certainly keeping the model busy. Either way, reports say that she will be co-hosting the 2019 Eurovision, and initially, Israel's own personal Wonder Woman, Gal Gadot, was also reportedly offered the gig, but she had to turn it down because of scheduling issues. Israelis don't seem to be too concerned, though, because the stars that will be taking on the hosting gig are already hugely popular in the Holy Land. All right, well, it's finally happened. Israel has approved the export of medical cannabis, and this groundbreaking decision is expected to increase the number of jobs, manufacturers, and investments in cannabis production. The move is, of course, causing stocks in medical cannabis to surge as well, but exports aren't actually going to begin until later this year. There are still bureaucratic procedures governing the export process that have yet to be put into place. The Agriculture Ministry, for one, will be opening a new department for Israeli farmers that will be focused on agro-medical cannabis growth.
Israel is has one of the leading technologies in creating products that are based on cannabis, the cannabis flower. Basically, it's intended to people who have diseases such as Parkinson's, such as cancer, and many other diseases to ease the pain. The global estimations of the cannabis medical products today in the world is estimated as more than 100 billion shekels, which is more than $25–30 billion, and it's a growing, very, very rapidly growing market. Israel today is on the edge of the technologies and the edge of actually producing those products, and we are very, very happy that today the government took a resolution that Israel will be a pioneer.
Thus, Israel now joins the Netherlands and Canada as one of the only nations on Earth that allows the legal export of medical cannabis. This is a big deal for many cannabis startups and technology companies too, which have been unable to develop their businesses because of Israel's strict export regulations.
We have the know-how, we have the knowledge what to do, but unfortunately till now I don't see where the solution is going to be in Israel without to open the doors and to go all over the world with our products.
As of now, the Israeli Agriculture Ministry has finally recognized medical cannabis as a legitimate crop, and 780 farmers have now received approval to advance growing plans. In fact, 5 growers have already received final approval to cultivate 22 acres of cannabis as well. All right, now the latest exhibition being showcased at the Design Museum Cologne is the solo exhibit by Dutch designer Martin Baas called Hide and Seek. And of course, ILTV's Emmanuel Kadosh went to check it out so that she could come back with all the details. Take a look.
Tell me, what was your favorite game growing up? Because mine was Hide and Seek. And I'm standing here right now at the Design Museum Cologne, ready to check out the solo exhibition, Hide and Seek, created by the bold and influential designer, Martin Baas. Let's go check it out.
The Hide and Seek exhibition was created by the young, Dutch, and award-winning Martin Baas, a designer that works on the verge of design and art.
As a designer, he's not looking only at the functional parts, he's looking also about how he's expressing himself and his thoughts through design.
Martin Baas is a very introspective designer. He's constantly looking at himself and the world he's living in and attempts to portray his thoughts through objects.
I think Martin Baas is one of the designers that behind his work there is a lot of thought. He's very much into thinking about different aspects of our lives, like what is time.
Speaking of time, if you make your way up to Baas's upper gallery, you'll be looking at time like you never have before. This has to be one of Martin's most poetic and interesting projects, which he calls real time.
So what's beyond interesting about this room is that the 2 clocks behind me and all the grandfather clocks in front of me were actually done with 12-hour videos. Actors were hired to mark and remark every minute for 12 hours to fit into Martin's grand plan, which is absolutely breathtaking.
He took furniture that he bought in a flea market and he burned them, and then he put epoxy resin on it in order to make them functional again.
Behind us on the screen, they're showing the process of burning the furniture. So you could see the before, the during the burning, and then this is the final product. It's pretty insane.
Lots of his furniture are done in a way that you think the children draw them. And that's the childish line that he's using. But then he's using a material that usually is not a material used in fans. Here it's clay. It makes his furniture very human.
So when you stand in the circus room, you can totally connect with the childish, introvert, mocking aspect of Baas's work, yet it's more mesmerizing than any circus I've ever been to.
He's criticizing us and himself through that circus that he's showing that we are part of.
Circuses have always kind of creeped me out a little bit, and then there's pieces like that start moving when you walk in front of it, and reminds me why I don't go to circuses that often. But then there's funky mirrors that make you look all skinny.
For anyone interested in coming to check out the Hide and Seek exhibition, don't worry, it'll be at the Design Museum Cologne until the end of April, and you definitely don't want to miss this.
And now for the Hebrew word of the day. Currently, the Hide and Seek exhibition by designer Martin Baas is on display at the Design Museum Cologne. So today's word is machbu'im, which translates to hide and seek. Now, coming from the same Hebrew word that means to hide, machbu'im literally means the hidden ones. But I can't really think of a better title for the game, at least not one that's so short and sweet. And I don't know about you, but machbu'im or hide and seek was also one of my favorite games growing up, even if some of the older players let me win from time to time. That being said, I was an excellent hider. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight you can expect scattered showers and a low of about 52 or 11 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow you can expect partly cloudy skies and a high of around 65 or 18 degrees Celsius. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.67 shekels to the American dollar. Remember to sign up for our daily newsletter at iltv.tv, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook at Israel English News and on Twitter at ILTV News. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you for watching.